17-year-old Sarah Mitchell stood in the courtroom with a composed posture that felt almost wrong as the jury foreperson began reading the verdict. Guilty on all counts, something chilling happened. She smiled, not nervously, not in shock. It was controlled, confident, almost defiant. The room froze. A woman behind her stifled a cry. That smile lingered longer than any moment should allow. But Sarah didn't know what was about to happen next. She didn't know that one man, a judge with decades of experience, had been watching her the entire trial, and he was about to make sure that smile would be the last thing she ever showed that courtroom with pride. Stories like this remind us that true accountability always finds its way. Justice doesn't care about composure or calculated smiles. If you believe that consequences matter, that arrogance has a price. Subscribe now. And in the comments below, tell us, what would you have done if you were in that judge's position? But to understand how Sarah Mitchell's confidence would shatter, we need to rewind. We need to see the family that trusted her. We need to understand the house that would become a crime scene. We need to follow the evidence that would leave no room for doubt. This isn't a story about a troubled teenager who made a mistake. This is a story about calculated control, about a family that never saw the danger sleeping in the room next to them, and about a justice system that would ultimately prove that arrogance always has an expiration date. This is how it all began. The October afternoon had turned the courtroom windows golden. Sarah Mitchell stood between her defense attorneys in a navy dress, deliberate, controlled, almost respectful. Months of preparation had led to this single moment. The jury had deliberated for only 7 hours. That should have terrified her. Instead, she remained still, her shoulders back, her chin level. The foreman stood. Every sound in the room seemed to pause, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The judge looked down from his elevated bench, his expression unchanged. He had seen this before. The young, the privileged, the ones who believed rules were suggestions. But something about this case was different. Something about her was different. On the count of first-degree homicide in the death of Robert Mitchell, how do you find? The foreman's voice was steady but heavy. Guilty. The word hung in the air like a sentence already pronounced. Sarah's eyes didn't waver, not a flicker. No dropped jaw, no trembling lip, no audible gasp. Instead, something almost imperceptible crossed her face, a softening at the corners of her mouth. Her shoulders moved slightly. She was smiling. Not a reaction, not a break, a choice. The woman behind her, Sarah's aunt, made a sound like an animal. Her body folded. But Sarah didn't acknowledge it. She kept her eyes forward, that small, private smile still visible to the jury, still visible to the cameras, still visible to a judge who was watching with the kind of attention that comes from decades of reading human behavior. The foreman continued. The verdicts cascaded like dominoes. Guilty, guilty, guilty. 4 separate counts, 4 lives gone. 4 guilty verdicts pronounced in a quiet, steady rhythm. And with each word, Sarah's composure didn't crack, it solidified. She was winning something in her mind. Some private calculation was resolving in her favor. The courtroom began to understand that they weren't watching a teenager receive justice. They were watching someone who had calculated that she could survive this, that she could walk out of this courtroom having convinced the world, or at least enough of it, that she deserved a second chance, that her youth mattered more than her actions, that her future was worth more than 4 lives already concluded. The judge set down his pen. His name was James Hendricks, and he had been on the bench for 31 years. He had sentenced murderers, defended children, listened to pleas from families who would never be whole again. He had learned long ago that the most dangerous criminals in America weren't always the ones who looked the part. Sometimes they were 17 years old and dressed in navy. Sometimes they smiled at the moment of conviction. Sometimes they believed that the system was still negotiable. He looked directly at Sarah Mitchell. That's when the temperature in the room seemed to shift. Sarah's smile didn't disappear, but something changed in her expression. A flicker of recognition. A single moment where she understood that the judge had seen something in her that she had been trying to hide from herself. The defense attorneys shifted nervously. They knew what was coming. The judge had already indicated during pre-trial that he wanted to address the courtroom after the verdict, and that he had something to say that went beyond the standard sentencing language, that he intended to do more than pronounce her fate. He intended to dismantle the narrative she had constructed. The bailiff stood, ready to proceed. But before he could move, Judge Hendricks raised his hand. He descended from the bench with a deliberation that drew every eye. He approached the witness stand and stood there, not behind his desk, not above the defendant, but at eye level with the people he was about to address. He looked at Sarah Mitchell first, then at the jury, then at the families sitting in the gallery, their faces already red from tears. What he said next would be recorded. What he said next would be replayed thousands of times. What he said next would dismantle, piece by piece, every calculation Sarah Mitchell had made about her own survival. Before we proceed to sentencing, Judge Hendricks began, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of courtroom experience. There is something that must be addressed, something that this court witnessed, and something that the record must reflect. He turned back to Sarah, and his eyes held an intensity that made even her breathing seem to pause. You smiled. The word was simple, but in the absolute silence of that courtroom, it became a condemnation. Not of her actions, everyone already knew what she had done, but of her character, of her inability to understand the gravity of what she had taken, of her fundamental inability to feel remorse. The smile, finally, was gone. The Mitchell family home sat on Laurel Street in Riverside, Connecticut. I'm in a neighborhood where the lawns were cut every Saturday and the gates were painted every spring. This was the kind of place where people jogged at sunrise, where children rode bicycles with training wheels on sidewalks, where the biggest neighborhood drama involved, whose turn it was to organize the annual block party. The house itself was a 1970s colonial, painted a soft gray with black shutters. 2 cars in the driveway. A basketball hoop installed in the drive. A garden in the front with hydrangeas that bloomed every June without fail. To anyone driving past, it looked like the kind of home where nothing bad ever happened, where discipline was gentle and love was consistent, where the rules were clear because the rules made sense. The mailman knew their names. The neighbors asked about their day. In every measurable way, The Mitchell family was the definition of normal. Robert Mitchell was a financial analyst at a mid-sized investment firm, 52 years old, had worked at the same company for 23 years, never missed a day of work unless someone was genuinely sick. He played golf on Saturday mornings with men he had known since college. He coached his youngest son's soccer team. He paid his taxes early. He had never been arrested, never been cited for speeding, never had a single blemish on his record. His wife, Catherine, was a high school English teacher, 48 years old, married to Robert for 25 years, beloved by her students, wrote detailed comments on every essay, attended parent-teacher conferences with a notebook full of questions about how to help her children learn. She baked cookies for school fundraisers. She volunteered at the library. She had friends who called her, not out of obligation, but out of genuine affection. Their marriage, by every external measure, was stable. No shouting matches, no affairs, no infidelity whispers in neighborhood coffee gatherings. They were, quite simply, the kind of parents that other parents tried to emulate. The younger children embodied the same quiet consistency. Michael was 14, a sophomore in high school with a respectable B+ average. He played trumpet in the school band. He had never been in serious trouble, though like most 14-year-old boys, he occasionally forgot to do his homework and had to be reminded twice about taking out the trash. Emma was 12 in 7th grade, quiet like her mother, with a collection of drawings taped to the refrigerator showing horses and ocean scenes, as she slept with a stuffed animal. She still asked her mother to braid her hair before school. She had friends over sometimes, and the sound of children laughing would drift through the open windows on spring afternoons. These were not troubled children. These were not children raised in chaos or neglect. These were children who had regular bedtimes, who ate dinner together most nights, who were loved in the steady, unglamorous way that builds a foundation. But Sarah Mitchell occupied a different place in this family architecture. 17 years old, already accepted to 3 colleges, a perfect GPA, debate team captain, volunteer tutor for younger students. The teachers used words like exceptional and mature for her age. Parents of her friends mentioned her to their own children as an example of how to manage academics without losing your mind. She had built a reputation for perfection so complete that most people in Riverside didn't know if it was genuine or performed. She smiled when she was supposed to. She said the right things. She displayed the right amount of concern, the right amount of ambition, the right amount of teenage attitude without crossing into disrespect. Beneath that performance, something else was growing. A resentment so quiet that only one person in the house could sense it, and that person, paradoxically, was the one least equipped to understand what it meant. The family rhythm was consistent. Dinner at 6:30, Monday through Friday. Breakfast together on weekends. Sarah helped with dishes on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Michael took out the trash. Emma set the table. Robert paid the bills. Catherine made the lists. Everything had a place. Everything had a purpose. Everything made sense to everyone, except the person who was beginning to believe that her life was a prison, that her family's expectations were suffocation, that her future, even with 3 college acceptances waiting, was being decided by people who didn't understand who she really was. No teacher saw it. No counselor detected it. No parent recognized the growing gap between who Sarah showed the world and who she believed herself to be. The house remained orderly. The family remained stable. The appearance of perfection held firm. On the evening of October 19th, the family followed their routine with perfect consistency. Dinner was lasagna. Michael complained about a history test. Emma asked to stay up 30 minutes later for a show she wanted to watch. Catherine said they could negotiate. Robert said the house was too cold and checked the thermostat. Sarah sat at the table and participated in the conversation, and nobody, not one person at that dinner table, understood that this would be the last meal they would eat together. Nobody knew that the lights would all go out that night as planned. Nobody knew that sleeping pills and careful timing were already being calculated in the mind of someone they trusted completely. The family dispersed to their rooms. Homework was completed. Lights were turned off. The house settled into the silence of sleep. But at 2:47 in the morning, one phone moved through the house. One person remained awake. One person had a different plan entirely. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window at approximately 8:15. The Mitchells' house, on any other Saturday, would have been stirring by now. Robert might have been scrolling through his phone with coffee in hand. Catherine would have been thinking about what to prepare for dinner. Michael might have still been sleeping, as teenage boys do on weekends. Emma would have been awake, possibly watching cartoons in the living room. But the house on Laurel Street remained silent. It remained perfectly still. The silence had a weight to it, not the peaceful silence of a family sleeping late, but something else entirely. Something that, in retrospect, it would later be described by investigators as wrongness. The kind of silence that your body recognizes as incorrect before your mind can identify why. Sarah's aunt, Margaret, had keys to the house. She and her sister Catherine had made plans months ago to go to a craft fair on Saturday morning. Margaret had called the night before to confirm. No answer. She had assumed Catherine was asleep. This wasn't unusual. Margaret had a key because the family occasionally locked themselves out, and Catherine trusted her to help in emergencies. Margaret pulled into the driveway at 8:30, her hands holding 2 steaming coffees from the local bakery. She parked behind Robert's car. She grabbed both cups and walked toward the front door. It was unlocked. That was the first indication that something was profoundly wrong. The Mitchell family did not leave doors unlocked. Catherine had installed a new deadbolt just 18 months ago. Robert had programmed the alarm system. They had a security sign in the yard that announced the house was monitored. Margaret felt her stomach shift, but she told herself there was a simple explanation. Maybe they had gone somewhere early. Maybe there was an emergency. Maybe they had forgotten to lock up during the confusion of getting everyone ready. She pushed the door open. The smell hit her immediately, a chemical tang mixed with something metallic and wrong. It wasn't strong enough to be overwhelming, but it was present. Later, forensic analysis would identify it as a combination of cordite residue and the harsh cleaner someone had used to wipe down certain surfaces. Margaret called out, "Catherine? Robert?" Her voice sounded small in the hallway. The house didn't respond. The living room was intact, furniture in place, nothing visibly disturbed. But the lights were on. All the main floor lights were on, though sunlight was now streaming through the windows. In a house where Catherine had always been careful about electricity costs, all the lights were deliberately illuminated. Margaret moved toward the kitchen. The coffee cups were still in her hands. She would later describe the moment when she realized she would never deliver them, when she understood that something catastrophic had happened in the hours since she had last spoken to her sister. The bedrooms upstairs told a story that Margaret's mind initially refused to process. Robert and Catherine in their room, positioned as if sleeping. Michael in his room, the same appearance of rest. Emma in hers. The way they were arranged, the stillness of their bodies, the absence of any sign of struggle. It created a tableau so carefully constructed that it almost worked. It almost seemed like they were simply asleep. But Margaret understood, without any medical training, without any forensic knowledge, that sleep was not what had taken hold of this family. She stood in the hallway and made a sound that later witnesses would describe as something between a gasp and a scream. She stumbled backward, her hand reaching for the wall to steady herself. The coffee cups fell. They shattered on the hardwood floor. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the profound silence of the house. Margaret called 911 from the kitchen landline. Her voice, when the dispatcher answered, was fractured. She couldn't articulate clearly what she had seen. She only knew that something was terribly, irrevocably wrong. The dispatcher kept her on the line, kept her talking, kept her from collapsing entirely. Police arrived within 7 minutes. The first officer through the door was James Patterson, a veteran with 16 years on the force. He had seen overdoses, accidents, suicides. He had attended classes on recognizing crime scenes. He had been trained to observe without contaminating. But nothing had prepared him for the calculated nature of what he was about to find. The house was not ransacked. There were no signs of forced entry. The doors were all locked from the inside. The windows were closed. And positioned in their beds, arranged with almost theatrical precision, was a family that would never wake up again. The investigation shifted immediately from possible accident to definite homicide. More officers arrived. The scene was secured. Photography began. The medical examiner was called. But within the first 20 minutes, something became apparent to the detectives who were already processing the crime scene. This wasn't a burglary interrupted. This wasn't a home invasion gone wrong. This wasn't a murder-suicide. This was something else. This was controlled. This was planned. This was someone who had wanted to make a statement with the bodies, with the careful arrangement, with the lights left on. In the corner of the master bedroom, on a small table beside Robert's bed, a security camera blinked with a small red light. The light that indicated it had recently been accessed. The light that meant someone had been inside the system. With someone who knew the house, someone who knew the technology, someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The house inventory took most of Saturday afternoon. While the medical examiner documented the victims, while forensic photographers captured every angle, while the neighborhood filled with police vehicles and news vans, Detective Maria Santos walked through each room with a notebook and a growing sense of confusion. Robert Mitchell's wallet sat on the nightstand. Inside were $340 in cash, credit cards, his driver's license. In Catherine's jewelry box were pieces that any professional burglar would have recognized immediately: a diamond engagement ring, a tennis bracelet, a pearl necklace inherited from her mother. In the office safe, which the detectives had opened with Robert's documented security codes, were approximately $12,000 in certificates and savings bonds. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing was missing. The television in the living room, a 55-inch model purchased 2 years ago for over $2,000, remained mounted on the wall. The laptop computers were still on the desks. The cameras were still in the closets. Every valuable, every item of monetary worth remained exactly where the family had left it. Santos stood in the master bedroom and looked at her partner, Detective Kevin Harris. Neither of them spoke, but the question was already forming in both of their minds simultaneously. If this was a burglary, why didn't the burglar take anything? The entry analysis deepened the contradiction. The front door showed no signs of forced entry. The lock was functioning correctly. The deadbolt had not been tampered with. The back door, which led to the patio, was intact. The windows were secure. Nobody had pried open a sliding glass door. Nobody had broken glass. Nobody had climbed through an attic access. The crime scene investigators photographed every potential point of entry, and the photographs told a consistent story. Whoever had entered this house had not broken in. They had either possessed keys, or they had been let inside voluntarily, or they had never left in the first place. The staging of a burglary was almost competent, but not quite. In 2 bedrooms, dresser drawers had been opened and some clothes scattered on the floor. But the drawers were closed too neatly. The clothes were folded in some cases. A professional burglar wouldn't have taken time to partially close drawers. A professional burglar would have torn through the house methodically. This was something else. This was someone imitating what a burglary looked like without actually understanding the kinetic reality of a desperate criminal searching for valuables. The ballistics report came back on Sunday morning. Single weapon. All 4 victims had been shot with the same firearm, same caliber, same angle of entry in most cases, same hesitation marks in 2 of the victims' rooms, suggesting the shooter had paused, had been deliberate, had taken time between shots. This was not a crime of passion. This was not someone who had panicked. This was someone who had methodically moved through the house, who had planned the sequence, who had understood the architecture of the home well enough to navigate between rooms in darkness. And the weapon had not been recovered at the scene. That meant the shooter had taken it with them, had hidden it, had disposed of it carefully. That meant the shooter was still out there. That meant the shooter had a plan that extended beyond the moment of murder. The timeline collapsed into horrifying clarity on Monday morning. The medical examiner's preliminary report, combined with witness statements about when the family had last been seen alive, pinpointed the murders to a window between 2:30 and 3:45 in the morning. All 4 victims had been killed within approximately 11 minutes. 11 minutes to move between 4 separate rooms. 11 minutes to shoot 4 people. 11 minutes to stage a burglary. 11 minutes to wipe down surfaces. 11 minutes to reset the security system. 11 minutes to leave no witnesses alive to contradict the narrative. This was not impulsive. This was practiced. This was someone who had thought through every detail, who understood the house completely, who knew where each person would be sleeping and how to reach them quietly. The shooter had moved with purpose, with knowledge, with the kind of confidence that comes only from knowing that nobody inside those bedrooms would question your presence. By Tuesday, the detectives had interviewed Sarah Mitchell twice. She had cried the first time, genuine seeming tears, the appropriate expressions of shock and grief. She had explained that she had slept through everything, that the sleeping pills she had taken for a mild anxiety had kept her unconscious, that she had woken only when her aunt screamed. She had been moved to a safe house with other relatives. She had been given victim services information. She had been treated with the kind of gentle compassion that law enforcement extends to traumatized teenagers who have lost their entire families. But something about her statement didn't align with the timeline. The medical examiner had noted that the sleeping pills in her system were present, but in quantities far lower than therapeutic doses. The amounts were consistent with taking less than a single pill. The amounts were consistent with wanting to appear unconscious without actually being rendered unconscious. The amounts were consistent with someone who needed plausible deniability. Detective Santos pulled the phone records on Wednesday morning. The Mitchell family had a home security system connected to their cellular network. Every action, every door opened, every camera accessed, every alarm, armed or disarmed, sent a notification to the household app. Sarah's phone had accessed the security system at 2:14 in the morning. The first victim had been found deceased at approximately 2:35. Sarah's phone had then accessed the system again at 3:07, resetting the alarm code. At 3:12, Sarah's phone had pinged a location tower that placed it back inside the house. These were not behaviors consistent with someone who was sleeping. These were behaviors consistent with someone who was awake, who was moving through the house, who was controlling the narrative of the crime scene. Santos printed the reports and placed them on the table. She looked at Harris. "We need to talk to her again," she said quietly. "And this time, we're not treating her as a victim." The interrogation room at Riverside Police Department was deliberately bland. Grey walls, a metal table, 2 chairs on one side, 2 on the other. A video camera mounted in the corner, its red light always recording. Sarah Mitchell sat in a chair that was deliberately slightly uncomfortable, not painful, but not designed for relaxation. She wore the same navy dress from Saturday morning, though someone had provided her with a cardigan because the police station was cold, and the victim services counselor had suggested a gesture of care. Across from her sat Detective Santos and a second detective named Marcus Webb. Between them was a folder containing the phone records. Between them was the timeline. Between them was the growing evidence that the victim in this case was also the perpetrator. But nobody had said that yet. First, they had to listen. First, they had to observe the disconnect between what Sarah said and what her body revealed. "I understand this is difficult," Detective Santos began, her voice carefully modulated to sound sympathetic while remaining clinically observant. "We just want to clarify a few details about Friday night, about what you remember." Sarah nodded. She folded her hands on the table. Her posture was upright. Her breathing was steady. She looked, to any casual observer, like a traumatized teenager doing her best to cooperate. "I've already told you," Sarah said. "I took my anxiety medication around 10 o'clock. I was tired from debate team competition. I went to bed. I didn't wake up until my aunt was screaming." The words were appropriate. The tone was measured. But something was absent. There was no emotion in the delivery. There was no tremor in her voice. There was no swallowing difficulty or eye contact avoidance that typically accompanies the recounting of family trauma. She delivered the statement like someone reading lines that she had memorized. Detective Webb leaned forward slightly. "Your anxiety medication. What's the name of it?" Sarah answered immediately. "Sertraline, 25 milligrams. I take it every night." This was verifiable. They had already checked her prescription records. The medication was real. The dosage was accurate. But the medical examiner's toxicology report had shown something different. The amount of the medication found in her system was fractional. It was consistent with taking perhaps a quarter of a pill, or possibly none at all, followed by placing a partially dissolved pill in her mouth sometime after the murders to establish an alibi. Webb didn't reveal this yet. He simply nodded and made a note. "And you didn't wake at any point during the night? No bathroom trips? No noise that disturbed you?" Sarah shook her head. "Nothing. I don't remember anything after my head hit the pillow." Santos opened the folder. She withdrew a printed copy of the phone location data. She placed it in front of Sarah without revealing what it contained. "Sarah, I need to ask you about your phone. Can you walk us through where your phone was on Friday night?" Sarah's eyes moved to the document. For the first time, for just a fraction of a second, her composure flickered. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Her eyes narrowed. Then the expression was gone, replaced by the same measured calm. "My phone was in my room, on my nightstand. It was charging." Santos nodded. "The whole night? It didn't leave your room?" Sarah hesitated. That hesitation lasted exactly 3 seconds, but in the interrogation room, 3 seconds felt like an eternity. "I don't think so," Sarah said. "I was asleep." Webb made another note. The hesitation had been recorded. The video camera had captured it. The shift in her energy, however brief, had been witnessed. "We actually pulled your phone records," Santos said, still speaking in that careful, clinical voice. "And we can see where your phone was at any given time based on the cellular towers it connected to." Sarah's hands, which had been folded neatly on the table, suddenly unclenched. She placed them flat on the surface, and a displacement activity, a sign of anxiety. "That doesn't make sense," Sarah said, and for the first time there was something in her voice. Not emotion exactly, but something harder, something that sounded like challenge. "My phone was in my room." Santos pulled out a second document. Your security system is connected to your phone app. Every action is logged. Every access is time-stamped. She placed the document down. Your phone accessed the security system at 2:14 in the morning. It appears your phone was also inside your house at 3:12 in the morning, based on the cellular data. The room went very still. Sarah looked at the documents without touching them. Her breathing, which had been steady and controlled, became almost imperceptible. The kind of breath control that comes from someone actively managing their emotional display. I don't know how that happened," Sarah said finally. Her voice had changed. The measured tone was still there, but underneath it was something new, something colder, something that reminded both detectives of a door closing. "My phone must have been picked up by the tower when I was sleeping. Phones do that sometimes." It was a reasonable explanation. It was technically possible that phone towers could register false pings. But the precision of the timeline, the specific nature of the security system access, the fact that it aligned perfectly with the medical examiner's window of death. These things created a narrative that no technical glitch could adequately explain. Webb decided to shift tactics. "How are you doing with everything, Sarah? Do you have questions about the funeral arrangements? And about what happens next?" The question was deliberately mundane. It was designed to catch someone off guard, to see if they would respond with normal grief language. "I'm managing," Sarah said. "When can I return to school? I have midterms coming up, and I want to make sure I don't fall behind. The college admissions officers said they could understand if my grades slip, but I don't want to give them a reason to reconsider." Webb and Santos exchanged a look. A 17-year-old girl whose entire family had been murdered. Murdered in the way that only someone inside the house could murder them, was concerned about college admissions. She wasn't asking about funeral arrangements. She wasn't asking about grief counseling. She wasn't asking about how the investigation was progressing. She was asking about school. She was asking about the future. She was asking about the continuation of her own life, as though 4 people hadn't just disappeared from hers. Santos made a note in her pad. It was a simple notation, just 3 words. But those 3 words would become central to the psychological profile that would eventually be used in court. Absence of affect. The digital forensics team worked through Wednesday and into Thursday morning. Sarah Mitchell's phone was now evidence, not personal property. Every file had been extracted. Every application had been analyzed. Every location data point had been mapped. The team leader was a technician named David Cho, someone who had spent 15 years teaching computers to tell the truth about human behavior. He sat in the evidence room surrounded by printouts, timelines, and metadata reports that painted a picture far more detailed than any eyewitness could ever provide. The phone didn't forget. The phone didn't lie. The phone recorded every digital footprint that Sarah had left behind, and those footprints led directly from her bedroom to each member of her family during the exact window when they were being murdered. The location data was the foundation. The cellular records showed that Sarah's phone had remained stationary in the house, in the master bedroom specifically, from 11:47 in the evening until 2:08 in the morning. Then it moved. The phone traveled to Michael's room at 2:14. it remained there for approximately 4 minutes. Then it moved to Emma's room, where it registered for 6 minutes. Then back to the hallway at 2:31. Then to the master bedroom, where Robert and Catherine were sleeping. The phone's movement through the house aligned perfectly with the timeline of the murders. The phone had visited each victim's location at precisely the time that victim had been killed. The phone had then returned to Sarah's room at 3:08 in the morning, where it remained until 8:30 when Margaret arrived at the house. This wasn't circumstantial. This wasn't suggestion. This was the device itself documenting the sequence of events. But the phone contained other evidence. Cho expanded his analysis to include deleted files, information that Sarah had attempted to remove, but that the recovery software could resurrect. Search history from 3 weeks prior showed queries about sleeping medications, about their effectiveness, about whether they would show up in standard toxicology reports. Another search asked about ballistic evidence and how to avoid leaving fingerprints. A third search, dated 2 days before the murders, was for information about crime scene cleanup and the effectiveness of various commercial cleaning products. These weren't searches conducted by someone planning an accident. These weren't searches conducted by someone in crisis. These were searches conducted by someone engaged in methodical planning. Someone who was researching not just how to commit the act, but how to survive the investigation afterward. The messages painted an even clearer picture. Sarah had deleted her text conversations, but the phone's backup system had retained them. One conversation, dated 3 months prior, was with a girl named Jessica from her debate team. The conversation had begun casually, typical teenage complaints about parents and siblings, but it had evolved into something darker. "My family is holding me back," Sarah had written. "They don't understand who I really am. I can't be myself as long as they're here. There's no escaping them. Not really." Jessica had responded with typical teenage empathy, suggesting that Sarah talk to a counselor. Sarah had replied, "Talking won't change anything. Sometimes you have to make your own freedom." The message had been sent on July 14th. The murders had occurred on October 19th. 97 days of planning. 97 days of resentment building beneath the surface of perfection. Another set of messages, this time with an online forum discussing narcissistic family dynamics, it showed Sarah asking questions about how to manipulate law enforcement investigations, how to establish alibis, how to stage crimes to look like something other than what they were. The forum contributors had been vague, most responding with advice to seek therapy rather than engage with the disturbing nature of the questions. But the questions themselves demonstrated premeditation at a level that transcended teenage impulsivity. This wasn't a moment of rage. This wasn't a crime born from sudden trauma or mental health crisis. This was calculated. This was researched. This was someone systematically removing obstacles to a future that she had envisioned without her family in it. The security camera footage from inside the house provided the final corroboration. Sarah had accessed the security system app 3 times during the critical window. The first access had disabled the recording function on all interior cameras. The second access, after the murders were complete, had deleted the footage of the bedroom hallway where she would have been walking between rooms. The third access had reset the system to factory settings, attempting to erase the access logs that would prove she had been the one manipulating it. She had failed to fully erase the backup data, information stored on the cloud server that she didn't know existed. The security company, when contacted by police, provided the complete access history. Every camera she had disabled, every file she had deleted, every attempt to cover her tracks, all documented, all preserved, all irrefutable. Detective Santos sat across from Sarah Mitchell a second time on Thursday afternoon. This time, the interrogation room had a different energy. This time, Santos didn't speak as though Sarah was a victim. This time, she placed the phone records directly on the table without explanation. She placed the deleted message screenshots on the table. She placed the security system access logs on the table. She placed the cellular tower data on the table. She placed all of it there. And then she said nothing. She simply waited. Sarah's eyes moved across the documents. Her composure, which had held so steadily through the first interrogation, began to show cracks. Her hands trembled slightly. Her breathing became shallow. Then she looked up at Detective Santos with an expression that combined defiance and something that looked almost like relief. I want a lawyer," she said. It was the most honest thing she had said since her family was discovered dead. It was also the moment that every law enforcement officer in the department understood that the case had shifted from investigation to prosecution. Sarah Mitchell was no longer a witness to her family's murder. She was the killer, and the evidence would prove it. Sarah Mitchell sat in the interrogation room with her attorney beside her, a public defender named Richard Carlson, who specialized in juvenile cases. Carlson had advised her not to speak without explicit legal immunity guarantees. But Sarah had insisted on proceeding. She wanted to talk, she had said. She wanted to explain. Carlson had warned her against this. He had told her that anything she said could be used against her in court. She had smiled at him, that same controlled smile that had appeared in the courtroom, and said that she had nothing to hide. It was a tactical error that would haunt Carlson for years. It was a moment where his client's narcissism overrode her instinct for self-preservation. Sarah believed she was smarter than the system. Sarah believed she could talk her way through this. Sarah believed that if she simply explained her position with enough eloquence and logic, the detectives would understand. They would see that what she had done wasn't murder. It was freedom. Detective Santos turned on the recording device. The time and date were logged. The participants were identified. The legal advisories were read. Then Santos began with a simple question. "Sarah, why don't you walk us through what happened on Friday night?" The attorney put his hand on Sarah's arm. She waved it away. "I want to explain," she said. "I want them to understand." She took a breath and began speaking. But the narrative she presented didn't match the evidence. She described hearing sounds. She described waking briefly. She described being confused about what was happening. Santos let her speak without interruption. Let her build her false narrative. Let her establish the inconsistencies that would later be used against her. When Sarah finished, Santos placed the phone records on the table again. "Sarah, Your phone accessed the security system at 2:14 in the morning. It was in Michael's room at that time. Sarah's composure flickered. "That doesn't mean I was there," she said. "My phone could have been anywhere." It was a reasonable objection, technically speaking. But then she made a mistake. She corrected Detective Webb on a detail about the crime scene, information that hadn't been released to the public, information that only the killer would know. She had said that the back door to the patio was locked from the inside, which was accurate. But Webb hadn't mentioned the back door at all. He had asked about entry points generally. The only way Sarah could have known that specific detail was if she had been there, if she had locked it herself, if she had ensured that nobody could come in from outside. She realized her mistake the moment the words left her mouth. Her eyes widened fractionally. Her hand gripped the edge of the table. "I must have heard my parents talking about it," she said quickly. It was a recovery, but not a convincing one. Her father had never mentioned the back door. There was no reason for the family to discuss it casually. Santos allowed the inconsistency to hang in the air. "Sarah, we've reviewed your search history. We've found documentation of research you conducted about how to avoid leaving evidence at a crime scene, how to stage a burglary, how to manipulate an investigation. Can you explain those searches?" Sarah's attorney leaned close and whispered something, but Sarah waved him off again. "I was curious," she said. Her voice had changed. The measured tone was gone. Underneath it now was something harder, something more raw. "I watch true crime shows. Lots of people research things like that. It doesn't mean anything." "The messages between you and Jessica from Debate Team," Santos continued. You wrote, "Sometimes you have to make your own freedom." What did you mean by that? Sarah's jaw tightened. For the first time, real anger appeared in her expression. "You're taking that out of context," she said. "I was venting about my parents being controlling. That's what teenagers do. It doesn't prove anything." But the tone had shifted. The anger suggested that Santos had touched something genuine. She had moved past Sarah's carefully constructed responses and reached something deeper, something authentic. Detective Webb decided to push further. "Your parents were controlling. Can you give me an example?" Sarah looked at him with an intensity that suggested she had been waiting for this question, waiting for someone to ask her to justify what she had done. "They decided everything for me," Sarah said, her voice rising slightly. "Not what classes I took, what colleges I applied to, what activities I should do. I wasn't allowed to make any real choices. I was supposed to be perfect, all the time. Perfect grades, perfect behavior, perfect daughter. But I wasn't allowed to be myself. I wasn't allowed to be who I actually am. They treated me like I was a possession, like I existed to fulfill their expectations." The words poured out. The performance had finally cracked. The narcissism underneath had emerged fully. She wasn't describing abuse. She was describing normal parenting. She was describing the kind of structure that exists in countless households. But in her mind, her parents' expectations had become unbearable constraint. Their love had become control. Their discipline had become oppression. In her mind, she had been imprisoned in her own home. "So, when you talk about making your own freedom," Santos said quietly, "you're talking about removing the obstacles, removing the people who stood between you and the life you wanted to live." Sarah met her eyes. For a moment, her attorney tried to interrupt, but Sarah spoke first. "They were in my way," she said flatly. "All of them. Michael was the golden boy. Emma was the favorite. My parents had already decided my entire life. I had acceptances to 3 universities. 3. But my mother wanted me to go to Yale. My father wanted Harvard. Neither of them cared what I wanted. They just wanted to control me." She paused. "I couldn't breathe in that house. Every day was suffocation. Every day was their expectations crushing me. So I did what I had to do. I made space for myself. I removed the obstacles." The words hung in the interrogation room with the weight of confession. She hadn't said the word kill. She hadn't said murder. She had used euphemisms, but everyone in the room understood exactly what she was describing. Detective Santos stopped the recording. She looked at Richard Carlson. Carlson's face had gone pale. He had advised against this interrogation. He had warned his client, but Sarah's narcissism had overridden his counsel. She had wanted to be understood. She had wanted to explain herself. She had wanted to justify what she had done. And in doing so, she had constructed a psychological profile that no defense attorney could spin in her favor. The charges were drafted that evening. 4 counts of first-degree homicide, 1 count of evidence tampering, 1 count of filing a false report. Sarah Mitchell was transferred to a juvenile detention facility. And for the first time since her family's bodies were discovered, the smile disappeared from her face. The arrest was conducted at the police station rather than at the detention facility. It was a procedural formality that needed to happen on record, with witnesses, with documentation that would later be presented in court. Sarah was brought back to the interrogation room at 4:47 on Thursday afternoon. Detective Santos was present. The public defender was present. And standing in the corner was a uniformed officer who would execute the arrest. Everything about the moment was choreographed. Everything about the procedure was designed to be unambiguous. Sarah sat across the table, her posture still upright, her expression still controlled. She had been sitting in the police station for nearly 8 hours. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't asked for water. She hadn't asked for anything. She had simply existed in a state of perfect composure, as if the events unfolding around her were happening to someone else. Detective Santos read the charges aloud. 4 counts of first-degree homicide, 1 count of evidence tampering, 1 count of filing a false police report. The charges were spoken slowly, deliberately, with pauses that allowed the weight of each one to settle. Sarah listened without visible reaction. Her expression didn't change. Her breathing didn't accelerate. She received the charges as though they were weather reports, information of minimal consequence. The uniformed officer stepped forward. He carried handcuffs that caught the fluorescent light of the interrogation room. The metal gleamed with a kind of terrible beauty. He approached Sarah from behind. His movements were professional, practiced. He had done this hundreds of times. He had arrested murderers and shoplifters, drunk drivers and domestic abusers. But something about the professionalism of the moment, the routine way that he moved, seemed to shatter something in Sarah's careful control. Not her composure, not her expression, but something underneath. Something that appeared in the way her shoulders tensed. The handcuffs closed around her wrists with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the small room. Click, click, the mechanism engaging, the metal tightening against her skin. Sarah had worn expensive bracelets her entire life. Delicate things, silver and gold. Decorative. These handcuffs were different. These handcuffs were functional. They were cold against her skin. They were a physical manifestation of something that her mind had been trying to deny. She was not in control anymore. The system had caught her. The evidence had bound her. The consequences were no longer theoretical. They were literal. They were metal around her wrists. The officer stood her up. He placed his hand gently on her shoulder, a gesture of guidance rather than aggression. But the gesture had an effect. Sarah's posture, which had remained so carefully maintained throughout the interrogation, suddenly shifted. Her shoulders dropped slightly. For just a moment, something that looked almost like reality flickered across her face. The walk through the police station to the holding area was the moment when the media discovered what was happening. News vans had been parked outside since the bodies were discovered. Reporters had been monitoring police scanners. The arrest of a juvenile in connection with the familicide case was the kind of story that local television stations would lead with. The kind of story that would be shared across social media platforms. The kind of story that would spark national interest. As Sarah was led through the hallway toward the holding area, cameras erupted. Flashbulbs created momentary blindness. Reporters shouted questions. "Sarah, did you do this? Why did you kill your family? Do you have any remorse?" The questions came in rapid succession, overlapping, creating a wall of noise and light. Sarah's head turned slightly toward the cameras, and for just a fraction of a second, the smile appeared again. Not the controlled, confident smile from the courtroom. Something else. Something that looked almost like defiance. Almost like satisfaction. The officer quickened his pace. Sarah was moved away from the cameras. But that moment, that single frame of her smiling during her arrest, was captured on multiple cameras. It would be replayed thousands of times. It would become the image that defined her in the public imagination. Behind her, in the police station lobby, her Aunt Margaret stood watching. She had been notified that the arrest was happening. She had come because she couldn't stay away. She needed to see this moment. She needed to witness the system responding to what had been done to her sister's family. Margaret's face was a study in conflicting emotions, rage, grief, a kind of hollow satisfaction that came from knowing that at least something was being done. At least some kind of justice was being pursued. But the satisfaction was hollow because it couldn't bring anyone back. It couldn't restore what had been taken. It could only move forward from loss. Margaret's husband stood beside her. He had his arm around her shoulders. He was supporting her weight slightly, as though she might collapse at any moment. Other relatives had gathered as well. Sarah's grandmother, Robert's brother, Catherine's mother. All of them watching as the daughter who had killed the family was led away in handcuffs. The transportation to the juvenile detention facility happened in a police vehicle designed specifically for prisoner transport. Sarah was placed in the back seat, separated from the officers by a protective barrier. The windows were covered so that she couldn't see out, and nobody outside could see in. She was alone in the darkness of the vehicle, alone with her thoughts, alone with the reality that was now unavoidable. The drive took 45 minutes. The detention facility was a separate building, designed to house juveniles who were being held while awaiting trial. It was not a prison, but it was not freedom either. It was a liminal space, somewhere between childhood and adulthood, between possibility and incarceration. Sarah was processed into the system. She was photographed. Her belongings were catalogued and stored. She was assigned a cell. She was given information about visitation hours and phone privileges. Everything was documented. Everything was recorded. She was no longer a free person. She was now a case number. She was inmate number 2847. She was the girl who smiled during her own arrest. She was the daughter who killed her family. She was the future of a courtroom drama that was only beginning to unfold. The first hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. Sarah had spent the weekend in the juvenile detention facility, confined to a cell, separated from the general population because of the notoriety of her case. Other inmates knew who she was. The guards knew who she was. Her image had been broadcast on every news station in New England. The 17-year-old girl who had killed her entire family had become a media sensation overnight. By the time she was transported to the courthouse, every detail of her appearance had been analyzed. What she was wearing, how her hair was styled, whether she looked remorseful, whether she looked defiant. The public had already begun forming opinions about her guilt or innocence, about her mental state, about whether she deserved the death penalty or rehabilitation. None of that mattered in the legal system, of course, but all of it mattered in the court of public opinion. And Sarah, it would become clear, cared deeply about the court of public opinion. The courtroom was packed. Judge James Hendricks had issued a ruling that would allow limited media presence, but the ruling had not prevented the overflow. Relatives of the Mitchell family filled one section of seating. Reporters with legal credentials filled another. Law students observing for educational purposes filled a third. And the public defender and the assistant district attorney had staked their positions. The jury pool hadn't been selected yet. The hearing was merely to establish procedure, set bail, and begin the process of discovery. But the atmosphere was already charged with the kind of energy that comes when a case crosses from local interest into national attention. The doors opened, and Sarah Mitchell was led into the courtroom. She was wearing a dark blazer and a white blouse. Her hair was neatly brushed. She looked like someone attending a school assembly, not a teenage defendant facing 4 counts of first-degree homicide. She scanned the courtroom with an expression that suggested she was taking inventory. Her eyes moved across the reporters. Her eyes moved across the families. Her eyes moved across the judge. There was something in that gaze that was unsettling. There was no fear in it. There was no shame in it. There was simply assessment. She was evaluating the room. She was understanding the dynamics. She was positioning herself within the architecture of justice. The public defender placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture meant to communicate stability and legal support. Sarah ignored it. She continued scanning, until her gaze settled on the gallery where victim photographs had been arranged on an easel. 4 photographs. Robert Mitchell smiling at the camera. Catherine Mitchell in a professional headshot. Michael Mitchell in his school portrait. Emma Mitchell with a gap-toothed grin, looking about 10 years old in the photo, forever frozen in that age. Sarah looked at these photographs for approximately 3 seconds. Then she looked away. There was no visible emotional reaction. She simply turned away as though the photographs held no meaning for her. Judge Hendricks entered the courtroom. Everyone stood. The judge took his seat. Everyone sat. The proceedings began with the standard formalities. The charges were read. The constitutional rights were explained. The public defender requested bail, arguing that Sarah had no prior criminal history, that she was a minor with family support, that she posed no flight risk. The assistant district attorney argued against bail, emphasizing the severity of the charges, the premeditated nature of the crime, the evidence of planning and cover-up. The judge listened to both arguments without visible reaction. Then he made his ruling. No bail. Sarah was to remain in custody pending trial, and the ruling seemed to have no effect on her. She didn't slump. She didn't appear disappointed. She simply accepted the information with the same detachment she had displayed throughout the hearing. As the hearing adjourned, Sarah stood to be led back into custody. But in that moment between adjournment and removal, the camera snapped. The media erupted with questions, and Sarah Mitchell, walking toward the bailiff, turned slightly toward the cameras. And she smiled, not broadly, not in a way that would be immediately obvious in a single photograph. But there was a smile. There was a lift at the corners of her mouth. There was the appearance of someone who had won something, who had outmaneuvered something, who had gotten away with something. The images would be broadcast on every news station that evening. The still photographs would be analyzed by commentators. The smile would become iconic, the image that defined not just the case, but Sarah herself. The cold, unfeeling teenager who could smile while standing accused of murdering her family. Judge Hendricks remained in his chamber after the hearing concluded. He reviewed the file. He read the police reports. He studied the evidence summaries. He looked at the photographs of the victims, and he made mental notes about the defendant. In his 31 years on the bench, he had encountered many types of criminal defendants. He had sentenced murderers who were consumed with remorse. He had sentenced white-collar criminals who maintained their innocence to the final moment. But he had rarely encountered someone who displayed the kind of emotional detachment that Sarah Mitchell demonstrated. It was as though she occupied a different reality than the rest of the courtroom, as though the consequences of her actions existed in some abstract dimension that she hadn't quite inhabited yet. The judge understood that this trial would require something more than standard procedure. This trial would require him to engage not just with the legal evidence, but with the psychology of someone who seemed fundamentally incapable of understanding the concept of human loss. The prosecutors began building their case with meticulous attention to detail. They coordinated with the forensic teams. They prepared the digital evidence for presentation. They organized the timeline in a way that would be unmistakable to a jury. They knew that the evidence was overwhelming. 4 counts of first-degree homicide were virtually certain to result in conviction. But they also understood something else. They understood that a jury needed to understand not just what Sarah had done, but who Sarah was. They needed to comprehend the narcissism, the entitlement, the fundamental absence of empathy that had allowed her to believe she could destroy her family and survive the consequences. The prosecutors began their preparation, knowing that they would be presenting not just a criminal case, but a window into the psychology of a killer who believed she was smarter than the system designed to hold her accountable. The trial began on November 15th, 3 weeks after Sarah's arrest. The courtroom had been reconfigured to accommodate the overwhelming media interest and public attention. Additional security had been installed. Separate entrances had been established to separate the press from the general public. Every seat was filled before the proceedings began. Judge Hendricks entered with the kind of gravitas that comes from understanding the historical significance of a moment. This case would be studied in law schools. This case would be referenced in psychological textbooks. This case would define the intersection of juvenile justice and familicide in the American legal system. The jury had been selected over the previous 2 weeks, 12 people and 4 alternates who had sworn to evaluate the evidence fairly and render a verdict based on facts rather than emotion or media influence. The prosecution's opening statement was methodical. The Assistant District Attorney, Patricia Morrison, walked the jury through the timeline step by step. She explained that they would hear evidence of meticulous planning. They would see digital documentation of premeditation. They would witness security footage that placed the defendant in specific locations at specific times during the exact window when the victims were murdered. She didn't use inflammatory language. She didn't appeal to emotion. She simply laid out the narrative that the evidence would prove. Morrison spoke for 45 minutes, and when she finished, the jury understood that they were about to witness a case where the facts were not in dispute. The only question would be whether the defendant could create reasonable doubt. The only question would be whether the evidence was as overwhelming as it appeared. The first witness was Detective Maria Santos. She testified for 3 full days. She walked the jury through the initial investigation. She explained the crime scene analysis. She described the staged burglary that had failed to conceal the reality of what had happened. She presented the timeline that showed all 4 victims died within 11 minutes. She explained how the entry points showed no signs of forced entry, suggesting the killer was someone the victims trusted completely. She presented the inventory that showed nothing had been stolen. She walked the jury through the inconsistencies in Sarah's initial statements. She presented the phone records. With each piece of testimony, the narrative became more and more solid. The defense attorney, Richard Carlson, attempted cross-examination, but his questions seemed to bounce off the wall of factual evidence without gaining traction. The digital forensics expert, David Cho, took the stand next. He presented the data in a way that was technical but comprehensible. He showed the jury how cellular towers track phone movement. He displayed the map of Sarah's phone traveling through the house during the critical window. He presented the access logs from the security system, showing when the cameras had been disabled. He showed the backup data proving those accesses had been made from Sarah's phone specifically. He presented the search history, the deleted messages, the research into crime scene cleanup and avoiding evidence. He presented it all methodically, allowing each piece of evidence to stack upon the previous one, creating a structure so solid that nothing could shake it. By the time Cho finished his testimony, the jury had a complete digital record of Sarah's movements and actions during the hours when her family was killed. The ballistics expert testified about the weapon. The same firearm had been used for all 4 murders. The trajectory of the bullets, the angle of entry, the powder burns on the victim's skin, all of it suggested a shooter who was competent, who was calm, who was standing at close range while deliberately ending lives. The expert explained that the shooting pattern was inconsistent with someone acting in panic or rage. It was consistent with someone executing a predetermined plan. The expert testified that the shooter had paused between shots, had taken time, had been deliberate. Under cross-examination, Carlson asked whether the expert could definitively prove that Sarah had fired the weapon, and the expert acknowledged that they could not. But the expert also testified that Sarah's phone placed her in the house, in the rooms where each victim was located, at the exact moments when each victim was killed. The jury didn't need the weapon to know what they were hearing. A forensic toxicologist testified about the medication found in Sarah's system. The quantity was inconsistent with therapeutic dosing. It was consistent with taking a fractional amount, enough to appear drugged without actually being rendered unconscious. The witness testified that this pattern suggested deception, that it suggested someone who wanted to appear as though they had been sleeping while actually remaining conscious and mobile. Sarah's attorney objected repeatedly, arguing that the testimony was speculative. But Judge Hendricks allowed it, a ruling that the testimony went to the question of Sarah's intent and credibility. The video evidence was presented on a large screen in the courtroom. Security camera footage from a neighbor's property showed Sarah leaving the house at 3:47 in the morning. She was carrying a bag. She was walking with purpose. She was moving toward the woods that bordered the property. She was gone for approximately 9 minutes. When she returned, she no longer carried the bag. The footage was silent, but it told a story that words couldn't enhance. Sarah had disposed of something. Sarah had hidden evidence. Sarah had attempted to conceal the weapon. The jury watched the footage. Then the prosecution asked them to watch it again. Sarah's attorney objected. Judge Hendricks allowed it. The jury watched a second time. Some jurors took notes. Some jurors simply stared at the screen. Some jurors looked directly at Sarah, searching her face for some sign of reaction. She gave them nothing. She sat perfectly still, her expression unchanged, as though the footage was of someone else entirely. By the time the prosecution rested its case, the evidence was overwhelming. 43 witnesses, hundreds of photographs, digital records, forensic analysis, timeline documentation, physical evidence. The case against Sarah Mitchell was so complete, so methodical, so undeniable that the defense's position had shifted from declaring innocence to attempting to establish reasonable doubt. Carlson stood to begin his case. But as he looked at the jury, as he understood the weight of the evidence they had absorbed, as he recognized the impossibility of his situation, something shifted in the courtroom. Everyone understood that what remained was not a trial in the traditional sense. What remained was a sentencing. What remained was the formality of allowing the defendant to present her side before the jury delivered a guilty verdict that seemed inevitable. Sarah Mitchell took the stand in her own defense on the 11th day of trial. This was her choice. Her attorney had advised against it. He had explained that the prosecution had already presented an overwhelming case, that allowing Sarah to testify would only give the prosecution an opportunity to confront her with contradictions, that her best chance lay in arguing reasonable doubt without putting her in the witness box. But Sarah had insisted. She wanted to tell her story. She wanted the jury to understand her perspective. She wanted to explain the circumstances that had led to her actions. She believed that she could outmaneuver the prosecutor in cross-examination. She believed that her intelligence, her composure, her ability to construct a compelling narrative would overcome the evidence. She was about to discover that belief and reality occupied very different territories. Sarah's direct examination, conducted by her attorney, was designed to be sympathetic. Carlson asked her about her childhood. He asked her about the pressure she felt from her parents. He asked her about feeling trapped and controlled. Sarah answered each question with the kind of measured articulation that had served her well in debate competitions. She spoke about her father's expectations regarding her academic performance. She spoke about her mother's involvement in every decision about her future. She spoke about feeling suffocated by their need to control every aspect of her life. She spoke about her siblings receiving different treatment, her brother being praised for athletic achievements, her sister being coddled because she was the youngest. She constructed a narrative of a young person crushed beneath parental expectations, gasping for freedom, desperate for autonomy. It was a compelling story. It was almost sympathetic. It was also almost entirely constructed from selective truth and reframing. Then Patricia Morrison stood for cross-examination. She approached the witness stand with the kind of deliberation that comes from someone who understands the psychological vulnerability of narcissists. Narcissists, Morrison knew, had a weakness. They could maintain composure in controlled situations. They could perform throughout formal interviews. They could construct narratives that seemed reasonable. But narcissists could not tolerate having their worldview challenged. They could not accept being questioned on their fundamental interpretation of events. They could not endure the experience of being disbelieved. Morrison began with a simple question. "Sarah, you say your parents were controlling. Can you give me a specific example of control that you would characterize as abusive?" Sarah answered that her mother had insisted she take certain classes rather than letting her choose her own curriculum. Morrison nodded and then asked, "Did your school allow you to choose your own curriculum, or is that a standard requirement for all students?" Sarah hesitated. Then she said that all students had to follow a general curriculum. Morrison asked the next question. "So, your mother didn't actually force you to do anything the school wasn't already requiring?" Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "It wasn't what she required," Sarah said. "It was how she pushed me. The pressure." Morrison nodded again and moved to the next question. For the next 3 hours, Morrison systematically dismantled Sarah's narrative. She asked about her parents' rules regarding curfew, then presented testimony from Sarah's friends about how reasonable those rules were. She asked about her parents' involvement in college selection, then presented documentation showing that Sarah had filled out applications independently, that her parents had said they would support her decision regardless of which college she chose. As she asked about feeling trapped, then presented text messages from Sarah to friends describing excitement about her college prospects and her future. With each exchange, Sarah's composure shifted. Her answers became shorter. Her tone became defensive. Her breathing became more controlled in a way that suggested she was actively managing her emotional response. Then Morrison addressed the evidence directly. "Sarah, your phone was in Michael's room at 2:14 in the morning on the night your family died. How do you explain that?" Sarah's response was rehearsed, practiced, ready. "I don't know. My phone could have been picked up by a tower." Morrison presented the backup data showing the security system access at exactly that moment. The security system was accessed from your phone at 2:14 in the morning. The same phone that was in your brother's room. How do you explain that? Sarah's answer became stammering. I don't remember accessing it." Morrison continued with methodical intensity. "Sarah, we've reviewed your search history. You researched how to avoid leaving fingerprints at a crime scene. You researched the effectiveness of various cleaning products. You researched whether sleeping medications would show up in toxicology reports. Can you explain why you were conducting this research if you didn't know what was going to happen?" Sarah's response came quickly, too quickly, with an edge of anger that hadn't been present before. "I watch true crime shows. Lots of people research things like that. It's normal." Morrison leaned forward slightly. "Is it normal to research these things specifically, Sarah? Is it normal to research them and then have your family murdered within weeks of conducting that research? Is that a coincidence you expect this jury to believe?" Sarah's hands, which had been folded neatly in her lap, suddenly unclenched. She gripped the arms of the witness stand. Her composure, which had held so perfectly for days, began to fracture. "You're twisting my words," she said, her voice rising. "You're making it sound like something it wasn't. My parents were controlling. They were suffocating me. I had a right to freedom." Morrison's response was quiet but cutting. "Freedom from your parents, or freedom achieved by murdering your parents?" Sarah stood up in the witness stand. "That's not fair. That's—" Judge Hendricks raised his hand. "Miss Mitchell, you will remain seated and answer the prosecutor's questions. You will not speak unless you are asked a direct question. Do you understand?" Sarah sat back down slowly. The composure was gone. Her face was flushed. Her breathing was visible. The jury watched as the confident, controlled teenager transformed into something else, something angry, something desperate, something that looked very much like guilt. The jury deliberated for 4 days, 96 hours behind closed doors, 96 hours of reviewing evidence, of discussing testimony, of wrestling with the weight of what they had witnessed. The courtroom remained empty during that time, but the courthouse hallways filled with the families of the victims, with reporters checking their phones constantly, with legal observers analyzing every possible angle. Sarah remained in custody at the detention facility. She was not brought to the courthouse during deliberations. There was no need. The jury would return when they had reached their verdict, and Sarah would be transported back to hear it. Judge Hendricks remained in his chamber, reading legal briefs, preparing for sentencing in case conviction occurred. He already knew what the verdict would be. Everyone in the courthouse knew. The only question was how long it would take the jury to formalize what the evidence had already proven, beyond any reasonable doubt. On the fourth day, at 2:47 in the afternoon, the jury buzzed. They had reached a decision. The bailiff notified Judge Hendricks. The bailiff notified the prosecutors. The bailiff notified the defense team. Notifications were sent to the detention facility. Sarah was transported immediately. She arrived at the courthouse at approximately 3:15 and was held in a secure room until the judge was ready to receive the verdict. The courtroom filled rapidly. Families arrived. Reporters filled the gallery. Law students who had been following the case came to witness the conclusion. The atmosphere was electric with tension and anticipation. This was the moment that everything had been building toward. This was the moment when the system would formally acknowledge what everyone already knew. Sarah was led into the courtroom at 3:47. She was wearing the same navy blazer and white blouse that she had worn throughout the trial. Her hair was neatly brushed. Her posture was upright. Her expression was composed. She took her seat beside her attorney. She didn't look at the gallery. She didn't acknowledge the families of the victims. She simply sat with the kind of stillness that suggested she was either supremely confident or completely dissociated from the reality of the moment. Judge Hendricks entered. Everyone stood. Everyone sat. The judge nodded to the bailiff. The bailiff rose. "Jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreman stood. He was a man in his 60s named Robert Chen, an accountant by profession, someone who had sat through every moment of testimony with meticulous attention. "We have, Your Honor," he said. His voice was steady, but grave. The courtroom held its breath. Silence descended with an almost physical presence. Robert Chen held a folded piece of paper, the paper that contained 4 verdicts, the paper that would determine whether Sarah Mitchell would be convicted of 4 counts of first-degree homicide. The foreman looked towards Sarah for just a moment, and in that moment, some communications seemed to pass between them. Not verbal, not conscious perhaps, but something in the exchange of glances created a shift. The foreman's expression was firm. His eyes held no sympathy. Sarah's expression remained unchanged. Judge Hendricks instructed the foreman to read the verdicts. On the first count of first-degree homicide in the death of Robert Mitchell, how do you find? The foreman opened the paper. His voice rang out clearly in the absolute silence of the courtroom. "Guilty." The word hung in the air. It didn't fade. It didn't soften. It simply existed as a fact now. Robert Mitchell's death was not a tragedy of circumstance. It was not an accident. It was murder. It was murder in the first degree. It was premeditated. It was deliberate. It was planned. The foreman continued. On the second count of first-degree homicide in the death of Catherine Mitchell, how do you find? His answer came as quickly. Guilty. Catherine Mitchell, the woman who had braided her daughter's hair, the woman who had written detailed comments on her students' essays, the woman who had built a life of quiet consistency and love. Her death was now formally acknowledged as murder, as deliberate killing, as something that was done to her rather than something that happened. Sarah's hands remained folded. Her breathing remained steady, but something in her expression shifted. The composure held, but underneath it was something else, something that looked almost like recognition. On the third count of first-degree homicide in the death of Michael Mitchell, how do you find? Guilty. Michael Mitchell, the 14-year-old who played trumpet, the boy who was figuring out who he was in the world, who would never figure it out now, who would remain forever 14. The verdict was guilty. The foreman turned to the final charge. On the fourth count of first-degree homicide in the death of Emma Mitchell, how do you find? The room seemed to hold its breath even more deeply. Emma was the youngest. Emma was the one most clearly innocent of whatever crimes the parents might have committed in Sarah's mind. Emma was simply a child. Guilty, the foreman said. 4 times. 4 guilty verdicts. 4 murders formally acknowledged by the legal system. And then Sarah Mitchell smiled. It was not the composed smile from the courtroom opening. It was not the controlled smile from the arrest. This smile was something different. This smile appeared to be almost involuntary. It appeared at the corners of her mouth, and then seemed to surprise her. She seemed to realize what her face was doing and attempted to suppress it. But it was too late. Every camera in the courtroom captured it. Every observer witnessed it. The jury saw it. The families saw it. Judge Hendricks saw it. And in that moment, as the smile flickered across Sarah's face, the judge understood something crystalline about the person sitting in front of him. This was not someone who was processing guilt. This was not someone who was experiencing the appropriate emotional response to being convicted of murdering her family. This was someone whose psychological architecture was so fundamentally different, so profoundly absent of empathy, that she could smile at her own conviction. This was someone who believed she had won something. This was someone who believed the game had gone according to plan. Judge James Hendricks did not immediately proceed with standard sentencing procedure. Instead, he set down his pen. He removed his reading glasses. He looked directly at Sarah Mitchell. The courtroom understood in that moment that something extraordinary was about to happen. Standard legal procedure dictates that sentencing occurs after conviction. Standard procedure involves predetermined sentencing guidelines, victim impact statements, and allocution rights. But Judge Hendricks had indicated through subtle signals that he intended to deviate from standard procedure. He intended to speak directly to the defendant before formal sentencing began. He intended to address the smile. He intended to address the disconnect between the gravity of what had occurred and the emotional response, or lack thereof, that Sarah had displayed. The gallery held completely silent. Even the reporters, trained to document every moment, seemed to understand that they were about to witness something that transcended normal courtroom procedure. Before we proceed to sentencing, Judge Hendricks began, his voice carrying the weight of 31 years of judicial authority. I believe this court has an obligation to address something that was witnessed just moments ago. The jury has found you guilty of 4 counts of first-degree homicide. The evidence presented to this jury was comprehensive, methodical, and overwhelming. The jury took 4 days to deliberate, not because there was doubt about your guilt, but because the responsibility of convicting a 17-year-old of multiple murders required careful reflection. Upon that verdict being read, upon hearing that you had been found guilty of taking 4 lives, the lives of your parents, your brother, and your sister, you smiled. He paused. The word smiled seemed to echo in the silence. I observed that smile. The jury observed that smile. The families of the victims observed that smile. The gallery observed that smile. And I want to address what that smile communicates about your understanding, or lack thereof, of what you have done. Judge Hendricks descended from the bench. He approached the witness stand, just as he had done after the verdict was read. He stood at eye level with Sarah. You are 17 years old. The law recognizes that adolescents are still developing cognitively and emotionally. The law recognizes that teenagers sometimes make catastrophic mistakes. The law recognizes that young people sometimes require rehabilitation rather than permanent punishment. But the law also recognizes that some young people understand exactly what they are doing. Some young people commit crimes with full awareness of their consequences, and some young people commit those crimes because they believe they are superior to the system designed to hold them accountable. I believe that describes you, Miss Mitchell. I believe you smiled because, in your mind, you have not actually lost. In your mind, you have still achieved something. In your mind, you have still maintained control. And I want to dismantle that illusion right now, in front of this courtroom, in front of this jury, in front of your family's families, and on the record, so that there is no possibility of misunderstanding. Robert Mitchell was 52 years old. The judge continued, his voice steady and deliberate. He had worked at the same company for 23 years. He had never been arrested. He had never caused harm to another human being. He coached his youngest son's soccer team. He played golf with friends he had known since college. He was, by every measure, a man who lived a decent life. You ended that life. Not because he had abused you, not because he had traumatized you, not because he had committed crimes. You ended his life because he did not allow you to make every decision in your household. You ended his life because he had expectations for your academic performance. You ended his life because his existence stood between you and an abstract concept of freedom that you had constructed in your mind. The judge paused. Sarah's composure was beginning to show cracks. Her breathing had become shallower. Her hands had begun to tremble slightly. Catherine Mitchell was 48 years old. She was a teacher. By all accounts, she was beloved by her students. She wrote detailed comments on their essays. She attended parent-teacher conferences with notebooks full of questions about how to help her children learn. She baked cookies for school fundraisers. She volunteered at the library. She was a woman who dedicated her life to helping others learn and grow. You ended that life. Not because she had harmed you, not because she had broken any law. Look, you ended her life because she was involved in decisions about your education. You ended her life because she cared about where you went to college. You ended her life because she loved you, and that love, in your mind, was suffocation. Judge Hendricks turned slightly, gesturing toward the photographs of the victims that remained displayed in the courtroom. Michael Mitchell was 14 years old. 14. He had barely begun his life. He played trumpet in the school band. He had friends. He had interests and aspirations and a future that was being built day by day. You ended that life. Not because he had wronged you, not because he had done anything to you except exist in your home. You ended his life because he was in your way. Because he was, in your calculation, an obstacle to your freedom. The judge's voice remained steady, but there was something in it now that sounded almost like grief, like the weight of understanding what had been taken. Emma Mitchell was 12 years old. 12. She slept with a stuffed animal. She asked her mother to braid her hair before school. She had drawings taped to the refrigerator. She was a child, an innocent child who had done nothing except be born into your family. You ended her life. Sarah's composure finally fractured visibly. Her shoulders began to tremble. Her face flushed red. Tears appeared in her eyes, not the controlled, performative tears she had displayed in earlier proceedings, but something that looked almost genuine, something that looked almost like the beginning of understanding. But Judge Hendricks did not soften. He did not offer comfort. He continued with the same measured intensity. You thought you were clever, Miss Mitchell. You thought your intelligence was superior to the system. You thought you could manipulate evidence. You thought you could stage a crime scene. You thought you could deceive law enforcement. You thought you could convince people of your innocence. But what you failed to understand is that systems of justice are built specifically to identify and hold accountable people who think they are above accountability. You did not outsmart the system. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work, and now you are going to experience the consequences. The smile you displayed upon hearing your conviction, Judge Hendricks said, his voice becoming quieter but somehow more powerful, will be the last smile you display in public as a free person. The confidence you have maintained throughout this trial will be dismantled piece by piece over the years to come, and you will have unlimited time to contemplate your choices, your arrogance, and the lives you stole. That is justice. That is what accountability looks like. That is what happens when you calculate that you are superior to a system built by a society that has decided that murder has consequences. The formal sentencing proceeded after Judge Hendricks returned to his elevated position on the bench. The courtroom had undergone a shift in energy. The judge's direct address had altered something fundamental in how everyone present understood the case. This was no longer simply a legal proceeding. This was a moment of moral reckoning. This was the system responding to narcissism with clarity. This was authority speaking truth to someone who had attempted to manipulate authority itself. Sarah sat motionless in her chair, her composure entirely shattered now. Her attorney placed a hand on her shoulder. She didn't acknowledge it. She simply stared forward with an expression that looked almost blank, as though her mind was attempting to process something that didn't fit into her predetermined understanding of how events would unfold. Sarah Mitchell, you have been found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree homicide. Before this court imposes sentence, do you wish to address the court? This was allocution, the defendant's legal right to speak before sentencing. Sarah's attorney leaned close and whispered something. Sarah shook her head. She did not wish to speak. Judge Hendricks nodded slightly, acknowledging her choice. Then it is the sentence of this court that on each count of first-degree homicide, you are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The words were simple. The implications were enormous. Life without parole. It was the functional equivalent of a death sentence, except that Sarah would be alive to experience every moment of it. She would wake up every morning in a prison cell for the remainder of her existence. She would grow old behind bars. She would never again experience freedom. She would never attend college. She would never have a career. She would never fall in love. She would never have children. She would never do any of the things that had motivated her to murder her family. These sentences are to run consecutively, Judge Hendricks continued. Our meaning that you will serve them one after another, not simultaneously. You are sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Additionally, on the charge of evidence tampering, you are sentenced to 15 years imprisonment, consecutive to the life sentences. On the charge of filing a false report, you are sentenced to 5 years imprisonment, consecutive to the other sentences. It is further ordered that you shall be remanded into the custody of the Department of Corrections and shall be transported to a state correctional facility for women to serve out your sentences. The judge paused. He looked directly at Sarah one final time. Do you understand these sentences? Sarah nodded mechanically. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely audible. Yes. One word. That was all she could manage. And the courtroom erupted, not in chaos, but in visible emotional response. The families of the victims, those who had been holding their grief in check for weeks, finally allowed themselves to cry, openly, without restraint. Robert's brother stood and wept. Catherine's mother collapsed forward, her body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from a place beyond language. Margaret, Sarah's aunt, sat with her hands covering her face. Behind her, other relatives held each other. There was no triumph in their tears. There was no satisfaction. There was only the acknowledgement that a sentence had been imposed, that some form of justice had been served, and that nothing would bring back the 4 people they had lost. The reporters scribbled notes. The cameras captured the moment. The legal observers understood that they had witnessed something historically significant. A judge had addressed the defendant directly. A judge had dismantled the narcissistic narrative. A judge had ensured that everyone in the courtroom understood not just the verdict, but the why beneath the verdict. Sarah sat motionless as the emotional response unfolded around her. Her attorney attempted to comfort her. She seemed not to notice. She seemed to be in a state of profound disconnection, as though her mind was still processing the reality that her calculated plan had failed, that her intelligence had not been sufficient to overcome the system, that her confidence had been misplaced, that her future, the future she had murdered her family to secure, had been erased entirely. The bailiff approached. It was time to return her to custody, time to transport her to the State Correctional Facility for Women, time to begin serving her sentences. Sarah stood. Her legs seemed unsteady. The bailiff provided support as she was led from the courtroom. She did not look back at the families. She did not acknowledge the gallery. She simply walked forward with the kind of mechanical movement that suggested her consciousness had partially retreated from the moment. As she was led through the hallway toward the secure exit, cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. "Sarah, do you have any final words? Do you have any remorse?" She didn't respond. She simply walked forward, her head slightly bowed, her composure gone, replaced with something that looked almost like shock. The video footage would be broadcast thousands of times. The image of Sarah Mitchell being led away to serve 4 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole would become the final defining image of the trial, not the smile from the verdict. But this image of someone who had believed herself superior to the system, being transported to prison, being removed from society, being erased from the world in all the ways that mattered. Judge Hendricks remained on the bench as the courtroom emptied. He sat in silence for several minutes after everyone had departed. He thought about the 4 photographs: Robert, Catherine, Michael, Emma. He thought about the families who would never be whole again. He thought about Sarah Mitchell, 17 years old, beginning a life sentence in a state prison facility. He thought about how the system had done what it was designed to do. It had identified guilt. It had proven it beyond reasonable doubt. It had imposed consequences. And in doing so, it had sent a message that would echo through courtrooms across the country. Arrogance has a price. Narcissism has consequences. Justice, when properly applied, is not merciful to those who believe themselves above it. The news coverage continued for weeks after Sarah Mitchell's sentencing. Local stations conducted follow-up reports about the case. National networks produced documentaries examining the intersection of narcissism and juvenile crime. Psychology professors began using the trial as a teaching tool in their courses. The case became a touchstone in discussions about parental control, adolescent rebellion, and the capacity for violence in seemingly ordinary teenagers. But gradually, the immediate intensity of media coverage began to fade. New stories emerged. New crimes demanded attention. The trial that had consumed Connecticut became archived footage, becoming historical reference rather than current event. Sarah Mitchell, locked away in a state correctional facility, began to fade from public consciousness. But the families of the victims did not forget. The community of Riverside did not forget. The legal system did not forget. The house on Laurel Street remained empty for months. Realtors attempted to list it. Potential buyers toured it. But something about the house, something about knowing what had happened within its walls, made it impossible to sell. Eventually, the property was purchased by a developer who demolished the structure entirely. In its place, a small memorial garden was constructed. Stone benches were installed. A plaque was placed bearing the names of the 4 victims and the dates of their birth and death. Robert Mitchell, 1972 to 2024. Catherine Mitchell, 1976 to 2024. Michael Mitchell, 2010 to 2024. Emma Mitchell, 2012 to 2024. The years seemed impossibly short. The lives seemed impossibly compressed. The garden became a place where families could walk and remember, where community members could acknowledge loss, where the neighborhood could process grief and move toward healing. Judge James Hendricks retired 2 years after Sarah Mitchell's sentencing. In his final remarks before leaving the bench, he referenced the case directly. He spoke about the importance of the legal system recognizing narcissism as distinct from other forms of criminal psychology. He spoke about the need for sentencing that reflected both punishment and permanent incapacitation. He spoke about the families who had been destroyed by someone they loved. He spoke about the responsibility of the judiciary to dismantle illusions and speak truth, even when, especially when, that truth was uncomfortable. His retirement remarks were published in legal journals. They were cited in future cases involving narcissistic defendants. They became part of the body of jurisprudence that defined how courts should respond to crime motivated by entitlement rather than desperation or mental illness. Judge Hendricks had used his authority not to lecture, but to ensure that the defendant understood the consequences of her actions. And in doing so, he had demonstrated what accountability looked like when properly applied. Sarah Mitchell's intake into the State Correctional Facility for Women was documented by prison officials but not publicized. She was processed like any other inmate. She was assigned a cell. She was given prison clothing. She was photographed for identification purposes. She was informed of the rules and regulations that would govern her life for the remainder of her existence. She was approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighed 118 pounds. She had auburn hair and green eyes. She had no distinguishing marks or tattoos. Her file contained her conviction record, her sentence, her psychological evaluation, noting narcissistic personality disorder with limited capacity for remorse or empathy, and a note from the intake counselor. Inmate maintains composure but displays minimal emotional range, appears disconnected from severity of crimes. Minimal engagement with rehabilitation programming. Recommend monitoring for self-harm or harm to others. Classification: high security with segregation considerations. Sarah Mitchell began her life sentence at age 17. She would be eligible for parole at age 94, assuming she lived that long, assuming the governor at that time decided to overturn existing law. In practical terms, she would die in prison. She would grow old in prison. She would age in prison in the way that people age when their futures have been erased. The smile disappeared. That was the most notable change in the photographic record maintained by prison officials. In the courtroom footage, in the trial photographs, in the arrest images, Sarah had displayed smiles, controlled smiles, confident smiles. Smiles that suggested someone who believed they were winning. But in the prison intake photograph, taken just hours after her sentencing, there was no smile. There was simply a young woman looking directly into a camera with an expression of profound neutrality, neither defiant nor remorseful, simply present, simply documented, simply beginning the process of becoming inmate number 47,382. Years passed. The media coverage faded entirely. The trial became history. The victims' names appeared less frequently in news reports. New crimes emerged to capture public attention. Sarah Mitchell's case became a reference point, something that legal professionals cited, something that true crime enthusiasts discussed in online forums, something that had happened and was now stored in the archives of the criminal justice system. But for those who had known the victims, the passage of time did not bring closure so much as it brought a different kind of pain. The pain of absence that never quite diminished. The pain of birthdays and holidays and life milestones that would never be celebrated by the people who should have celebrated them. Catherine would never see her children graduate from college. Robert would never meet his grandchildren. Michael and Emma would never experience the full span of their lives. The final question that echoes through this case is one that every observer must answer for themselves. Was justice served? A 17-year-old girl is now serving 4 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. She will die in prison. She will never again experience freedom. Her future has been erased as thoroughly as she erased the futures of her family members. Some would say that is justice. Some would say that is proportional punishment. Some would say that is exactly what the system is designed to deliver: accountability, consequences, and the permanent removal of a threat from society. But others might look at this case and ask whether confining a teenager for the remainder of her life actually achieves anything beyond punishment, whether it serves any purpose beyond retribution, whether the system that convicted Sarah Mitchell is serving justice or simply perpetuating cycles of violence and loss. What is certain is this: Sarah Mitchell will spend every day of her remaining life contemplating the decisions that led her to that courtroom. She will have unlimited time to understand the consequences of her actions. She will grow old behind bars. She will experience the passage of time in a way that most people never will, with the absolute knowledge that nothing she does will ever change her circumstances. Her intelligence, which she believed was superior to the system, has become the instrument of her own torment. Her confidence has been replaced with the mundane reality of prison routine. And the smile that once appeared at the moment of her conviction, the smile that suggested she had won, has never appeared again. Authority, it turns out, always outlasts arrogance. Justice, when properly applied, always finds a way. And the consequences of narcissism, in the end, are not abstract concepts to be debated in philosophy seminars. They are lived day after day in prison cells where the future has been erased and only the past remains, unchangeable and absolute.